Good morning, Grid Connections listeners. Today we're joined again by guest Tu Li, the founder of Sino Auto Insights. And he's here to unpack China's profound impact on everything from electric vehicles and EV charging infrastructure to the rise of plug-in hybrids and the competitive landscape of the Chinese EV market. We'll also discuss what global tariffs could mean for Chinese-made vehicles and how these changes might ripple through the global automotive industry. Before we get started, though, I want to ask a favor. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with at least one person you think would love it too. And don't forget to leave us a positive review on our podcast page. Your support helps us continue bringing you insights from industry leaders like Tu Li today. With that, enjoy.
Jace, thanks for having me on again.
I think just to kind of kick it off, I mean, I was looking back at our episode. It was almost a year ago that
that
you were
right?
on.
Okay.
Yeah, which it doesn't seem like that long, but even in that past year, there's been so much change. I think, unfortunately, some of the challenges we probably talked about last year are still present. But I wanted to kind of talk with you first about, for anyone listening today that might not be familiar with your work. As I said, you have a really strong background in a few different fields of lived experience. And even before we went live, we were kind of talking about one of the things I really admire about your work versus like the keyboard warriors out there is you get on the plane, you get behind the wheel. You actually are out there in a lot of different markets, seeing firsthand what is happening in the space. So just real quickly, if you could just give us a background about a little bit more around that and what Sino Auto Insights brings to the industry.
Sure. Let me take a few minutes because I'm sure you've grown your audience, so maybe they didn't listen to the first episode that we had together. Tu Li grew up in Detroit. First job was at General Motors and worked in the automotive industry for a few years before going back to graduate school and then moving out to Silicon Valley. I'd spent almost 7 years there working in high tech. At two companies that I believe are probably arguably the best in hardware and software integration from a product standpoint, Apple and Logitech. And so I learned a ton from a digital standpoint and understanding digital products and how fast a high tech market and sector moves. And then I met a girl, a woman in San Francisco, and she happened to get transferred over to Beijing. And I'm actually Vietnamese, so I'm not Chinese, so I can't I couldn't speak the language at that time, but then ended up chasing her over and into Beijing, and what we thought was going to be 3, 4, 5 year thing ended up being 12 and a half years. And about 7 years ago, I started a consultancy called Sino Auto Insights. Our tagline is we're at the intersection of technology and transportation. We have 3 core beliefs. One is innovation is now moving east to west. Think TikTok, think DJI, drones. Number 2 is that all companies are becoming software companies. I actually need to probably cross that out and say are going to be AI companies. And the third thing is you're not moving fast enough. And if we've learned anything, we saw Ford is slowing down on the EVs. We saw GM laying off people this week. We're seeing this disruption. And actually, let me take that back, Chase. It's not a disruption. It's a reset. That's how broad and deep what's happening in the transportation sector is. And to your point, having lived in China for 13 years, I got to see the Neos, the Xpengs, the Li Autos, the BYDs mature and grow into the players that they are right now in the China market. And to give your listeners some perspective, last month was the first month China had reached 50% take rate on passenger vehicle sales that were clean energy vehicles. So clean energy vehicles, and we can argue, because I know a lot of people out there don't think PHEVs are clean energy vehicles, but the Chinese government considers them to be clean energy. So they call them NEVs or new energy vehicles. So battery electric, plug-in hybrid, and fuel cell electric vehicles. And China became the largest passenger vehicle market in 2009, overtaking the United States. This year, they're probably at around 26.5 million cars. And if we're thinking of half of those are going to be NEVs or close to half of them this year, when the United States is going to be around probably 1.2, 1.4 million, gives you some perspective on how competitive the market is. Tesla's even struggling in China. So, and to your point, before I bogart this entire conversation, I was just there in April for the Beijing Auto Show, got to meet up with a lot of Chinese EV companies, try out their vehicles. We actually, with my co-host or for our podcast, China EVs and More, we drove Xpeng G9 from Beijing to Shenzhen, about 1,500 miles, using mostly level 2 intelligent driving. So that was interesting. And again, to your point, uh, I try to separate myself from the people that are critiquing the Chinese EV industry, because I'm out there trying it out. And I'd mentioned this before we started recording. I also am driving a Lucid right now for a week to try that out. So I'm able to compare and contrast the Chinese EVs and some of the European and American EVs too. So.
Yeah, I think that's a great overview of what I've always really found really entertaining about your work and just really the perspective. It's definitely based, I think, in an optimistic light of like how to help a lot of these automakers that are struggling with the move to electric vehicles, but also kind of bring the facts that there's a lot going on right now in China that's really pushing the industry forward. And sometimes I don't know if the US, especially, is seeing as big of the direct impact as maybe like the European market is already with Chinese electric vehicles. But with a lot of the stuff you've already talked about just there, I think that gives us quite a bit for what we're going to go over in today's episode. But I think you mentioned driving the Lucids. Let's just kind of start there. That's a really interesting one because they are definitely still in the startup phase. I think there's a growing interest in their product, but they're pretty still small. But they're taking more of the startup approach. They're putting a pretty strong focus on efficiency with their electric vehicles. They're putting a focus on software. And with this kind of drive you're doing right now and your experience, what have been your takeaways with one of the newer, more successful startups in the American EV space?
Well, I would debate whether they're successful yet. I
Fair.
think that they have their second product that's going into production, the Gravity, which is an SUV, but it's still at the $80,000 price point.
For
And
sure.
so if we look at the US EV makers, there's really only Lucid and Rivian, arguably.
Yeah,
Now, Kia and Hyundai have really taken up the mantle from a legacy standpoint. And that's because up until recently, when GM launched the Equinox and the Blazer EVs, there was really no challengers, right? Ford had the F-150 Lightning, which was a truck, and which they said was going to start at $40,000. I think it starts at 57 now. And the Mach E has largely been unchanged since it launched. And so we're seeing the Koreans really take advantage of the gap in products or affordable products for most Americans.
for
And
sure.
that's where Lucid is. You know, the Air starts at around $70,000. And so it's not something that most people can afford. I can't really afford it myself. But what I will say about it is that for specifically for a first effort, it's a great car. I think if you get behind the wheel, I don't hear any rattles. I don't hear any little quality issues that you would normally see in startup cars or early production vehicles. So they've been able to dial in, uh, even with a small production base, some of the early issues that they've had. Now there's some quirks with the vehicle, but I don't. I've only spent a couple days with it, so I want to spend a few more miles behind it before I really judge it
Yeah. No,
harshly.
I think that's all pretty fair. And
It's
I think,
stupid fast, though. Let me say that. It's stupid fast, and the battery tech is significant. It's much the range is much higher than other comparable vehicles, which is game changing because I think one of the topics you wanted to talk about is Chinese battery technology. So, compare and contrast that. We can talk about that later, though.
yeah, for sure. I think just to follow up with that, I think one, you made a great point of saying maybe successful is a bit early to call them that. I kind of mean it. I feel like you're right. It's like them and Rivian are still like the only two domestically. I feel like there's the Lordstown Motors and so many other EV companies that got fundraising, all this stuff that have just kind of fallen by the wayside. And they seem to be still moving forward. I will say I definitely see a lot more Rivians on the road than I do Lucids. And part of that is due to product and, like you said, the price point. But one of the, I think, early negative kind of feedback about the Lucid was its software. And from what I've heard, that's definitely improved. And I think that is such a big, from what you've also said, the software experience and kind of having that user defined vehicle is huge. I think not just in the Chinese market, but especially with younger car buyers in particular. And I think that's one of the things that, whether intentional or not, Tesla did have a lot of success with their EVs when growing, was that element of it. And given the exposure that you have to a lot more of the Chinese EVs that really excel at that, is that something you would say the Lucid is good at, or is it still need quite a bit of refinement, in your opinion, to kind of hit that, I think, what is now kind of a bar set of a user defined vehicle, whether that be from like the Teslas of the world, or I think even more so with a lot of the Chinese EV automakers?
First, I got to give you kudos, Chase, because you said user defined. I hate when people say software defined. I won't say hate, but I think software defined is a terrible acronym,
Well,
or because
guess where I got that from. Let's put it that way.
so anyways, because software doesn't define the vehicle, it enables the user experience, a good or bad one based on the design. But to answer your question, and sorry to go off on a tangent there, but I was like pumped when I heard you say that. um, I have not encountered any significant bugs on the software side. The interface is fairly simple, and the the fit and finish of the materials is really nice. Again, no squeaks and rattles. And in an electric vehicle, it's amplified because you don't hear the motor.
Right.
And so that's really, really important to note. And it's super roomy. I have two kids, and they can lounge in the back seat because they pulled the wheels out. But it creates a weird trunk ingress egress because it's like a clamshell, and it's flat, but it's a little awkward. And but the front is amazing,
Yeah.
and I really enjoy driving it. It has some steering feel. There are a bunch of cars that I've driven in the past that kind of feel like you're floating a little bit when you're steering. This one has some bite to it, which is great because it makes you feel the ground a little bit. Again, I'm not one of those car reviewers. If I would recommend you watch videos from those professional car reviewers. I think they just send it to me because they wanted to get an objective opinion on what is good, what could be improved. But so far, so good. Nothing that stands out in a negative way. So,
No, that's great. I think that might be an interesting kind of pivot
except the
to,
price point. Let me just
yeah, that's
except the
fair,
price point.
fair for sure. And it's interesting you mentioned kind of just the driving dynamics of it, because I think earlier this year I had the chance to test drive Rivian R1S, and obviously much different vehicle. But I was surprised how boaty feeling it was for even for an SUV. And I think that was something that I kind of hadn't expected and been spoiled with a lot of other EVs I've driven that just, you have to obviously be very, you have to put it kind of front and center when you're designing an electric vehicle to make it feel more sporty and or at least like have that kind of connection to the road. And that was one of the things that surprised me and has consistently been a positive I've heard about the Lucid. But kind of focusing on more of the focus of today's discussion, which is around kind of looking at Chinese EVs. And you mentioned kind of how they have been also counting plug-in hybrids towards some of this new electric vehicle mandates and stuff they have. How are you seeing, because even as you mentioned, a lot of the domestic automakers are definitely pulling back on their EVs. Some of that investments in the software side, some of that's investments in actual product side. How are you seeing it in just domestically and then comparing that to China? Because I know a lot of people, I think from the more traditional auto industry, had kind of complained, oh, part of the reason they've been so successful in China is incentives. And then they even use like the European Union as an example, or specifically Germany, that had really good incentives for EVs. And then like the instant they stopped those, EV sales did take a pretty serious nosedive. And it doesn't seem like that's been quite the case in China, but I'd really love to hear your kind of thoughts on um, how that differs around the idea of moving the auto industry forward with EVs and then how plug-in hybrids play into that.
Let me address the elephant in the room first. So the Chinese EV companies in general have received significant subsidies for the development of their companies and technologies. And that's happened starting in 2009. And if you look at sales throughout 2009 until today, the inflection point started in right around 2020. Okay. That also happens to be when job one of the Shanghai Gigafactory rolled off the line, Model 3. And so, even with substantial subsidies from the Chinese government, these Chinese EV companies, you can Google it. NIO in 2017, 2018 was on the verge of bankruptcy. Xpeng was
Right.
struggling a bit. And I think it took Tesla to really catalyze and bring much more interest, eyeballs to the sector. And then COVID happened. And there was, for the West, anyways, it was like they were flying blind now. They didn't see what was going on in China with regards to take rates. I can tell you, in 2020, there's 1.5 million cars or NEVs sold. 2021, there's 3.5. 2022, 6.5. Last year, around 8.5 million NEVs sold. This year, probably getting close to 10 million. And I can also tell you, I was there because I was stuck in China because of COVID. And we didn't leave until 2022. So I've been back in the United States for the last couple of years, still travel quite a bit back to China, but now home base is here. So the proliferation of green license plates, typical ICE vehicles in China have blue plates. ICE or NEVs have green plates. And so you just see more and more of those, uh, starting in 2019, 2020. And now they dominate most of the tier one cities. And with regards to the subsidies, Europe and the United States have to be in it for the long haul, because if they only dabble in incentivizing consumers to purchase EVs, you're going to see this tail off if you pull subsidies too early. In China, the market took over. And so they were able to dial back some of those subsidies. And what we're seeing now, there was a CNBC video that I was a part of that dropped a couple of weeks ago. They said there's 140 EV brands in China. So if you could imagine being able to choose from 20, 30 brands, Chase, that have products on almost every price segment and almost any feature that you would want, and compare and contrast that to the United States. How many $50,000 EVs are in the market, number one? How
Right.
many of them have the features that you want, number two? And I'll go a step further. The ID Buzz just was announced for uh, US sales. $70,000, 230 or 250, 230 miles of range. The product is not complete. How
Yeah.
how are you selling this thing for $70,000 when it only has 230 miles of range? So I'm torn. Should car makers launch vehicles that don't seem to be competitive? And they're definitely not going to be able to compete with those specifications in China. But or do they wait? Like a Ford says, we're not going to launch a full size SUV EV until 2027. I
Right.
don't know what the right answer is, but all I know is that the product's half done, and Volkswagen seems to be satisfied with overcharging for an
Yeah.
underperforming EV. So
Well, and I think that vehicle especially kind of speaks to some of the electric vehicles currently in the US, where it is definitely lifestyle focused versus like being a practical or obviously affordable option for most people. And I'm kind of curious when you talk about China and like you tell me there's 30 brands out there. That's what we kind of keep hearing. To me, that says that especially with what we're also hearing about kind of a price war in China with EVs, that eventually, that sooner or later, that's going to be more consolidation of those brands. Do you think that that is likely to happen? And is the price war we kind of keep hearing about EVs in China as big of a thing as it actually is? Or is it just kind of the market you think sorting itself out?
there's a few different things going on. So the China economy is is lukewarm. It's not going great. Not compared to pre-COVID days. And
Right.
so um, Chinese consumers are really being um, careful of what they spend their hard-earned money on. And so we talk about consolidation in the China market. Before EVs, there was always talk about consolidation as well. So can
Fair.
140 brands survive in China? No. But we need to look at the China market and how the foreign legacies compete in that market separately from what's happening in Europe and the United States.
For sure.
Because the fact of the matter is, 140 Chinese EV brands are not going to be exporting to the United States. There might be 15, 20 brands that try to, but there might be three or four that are successful being long term players. If we look at the Koreans, we look at the Japanese, right now it's Honda, Nissan, Mazda to a lesser extent, and Toyota. So there's only a handful of players. And I don't see 20, 30 Chinese brands being very
Right.
successful in the United States, because I don't think there is a room for that many brands in the automotive space in the United States. And so for us to look at it, uh, we're not going to have that many choices. But
Hmm.
what's important is that Tesla pushed along the Chinese EV players, and the market is the way it is. If the Chinese EV companies come to the United States, whether they're successful or not, they're going to create more competition for the
Yeah.
US consumer. And that means the Detroit 3 will need to step up in a big way. Because right now, Hyundai Kia is eating their lunch.
Right.
If there are three, four, five more players, and we haven't even talked about Tesla, but Tesla is still pretty competitive, although their products are 3, 4, 5 years old,
Yeah.
largely unchanged in the market. And
And
that's why they're struggling in China. So
yeah, and I think you said something, if I remember right, on an Autoline episode recently, where you were kind of talking about how like Tesla is not like maybe the leader anymore as far as like innovation in the eyes of maybe Chinese buyers, but they're kind of looked at as almost like the safe play. Like if you want an EV and you get a Tesla, it's a safe play. Like it'll work, it'll be fine. Is that accurate, or has that kind of changed a little bit? Are they starting to see the Chinese EVs be more of interest than a Tesla? Obviously, more so than like traditional legacy automakers.
Right now in the China market, there's really two winners and a lot of losers, or a
Fair.
lot of ultra competitive
Yeah,
companies that
they're
haven't been
struggling.
able to separate themselves. The first
Interesting.
company is Tesla, and the champion is BYD, and this is a champion in a big way. They sell about 350,000 vehicles a month. Almost half of those are plug-in hybrids. So they can offer you a vehicle in any powertrain, although only on clean energy. So it's either
Right.
PHEV or BEV, and they live in the mass market. And so their products generally are less than 30, 40,000 US dollars. And it's important to note that 85, 90% of all vehicles sold in China are less than $50,000.
That's pretty.
Whereas in the United States, over the last few years, the
Yeah.
average price of a vehicle has gone up to $53,000. And we're not even talking EV.
Right.
But the economics are such that now it's as cheap or cheaper in some certain instances to make an EV versus an ICE in China.
Which is
So we've reached
pretty
parity
wild.
in China.
Yeah.
So
Now, you said Tesla coming to the Chinese market was kind of a motivating moment to the Chinese automakers to get competitive, to kind of push them forward. Why do you think that that hasn't quite been the case? I mean, I would say obviously Tesla motivated a lot of domestic automakers to make and offer electric vehicles, but it definitely seems like it wasn't quite the like shooting gun kind of starting the race um, impact that we in China that it has been here. And do you think that that's partially due to the actual products themselves and maybe the traditional automakers being so truck and large vehicle heavy? Or is there something else that's really that kind of made Tesla's entry into China kind of kick off a competition race in the EV space, a much bigger event?
it's definitely the unique use cases that Americans have. They, in Michigan, many folks have boats, they have trailer hitches, and they do road trips because we have so much highway uh, mileage all over
Right.
the United States. And in China, the thought of road tripping is newer, and it's mostly cities that are very, very vastly populated. Now, I lived in Beijing and Shanghai, two of the largest cities in the world, and we're talking over 20 million people. So
Yeah.
my neighborhood in Beijing was probably larger than some states. And so, again, just to emphasize the different use cases. But at the end of the day, Chase, you and I know it's all about price.
Right.
And in China, it's all about value because of the price war. Incidentally, that Tesla launched in January of 2023 because they had a 3 and a 4-year old Model 3 and Model Y. They needed to lower the price in order to bring more consumers back to their vehicles. And so another thing that the legacies will struggle to do is refresh vehicles on a timely
Yeah.
basis. In China, cars get refreshed now every 9 months, every 10 months. And I just mentioned to you Tesla hasn't refreshed in a major way the 3 or Y in 3 or 4 years. That's just not going to get it done in China. And so the it's too competitive in
Yeah.
China,
Well, I was
which
going to say
is,
that kind of I that makes me think going back to the question I had around consolidation, like that level, that many brands with that level of refreshing just doesn't seem, even when you have a very large car buying public, just doesn't seem sustainable. And I think it's kind of funny you say that because yes, Tesla does in some ways have older products, but a big thing that really pushed the American automakers forward was the fact of how quickly Tesla could iterate and make changes on the fly to their products that just was not a thing for US automakers. And so I'm kind of curious about with, or I'm sorry, were you going to say something there?
well, Tesla doesn't have that advantage in China
For sure,
because
for sure.
there's so many software companies and people that have experience writing code. And so let's lump Tesla into the
Yeah,
Chinese EV startups, where 80% of the engineers at a Chinese EV company, and let's say Tesla, are going to be software developers and software
right.
engineers. 20% are going to be traditional automotive engineers. And at GM, at Ford, at Volkswagen, that number is flip flop,
Easily, yeah.
meaning 80% traditional automotive engineers, maybe 20% software engineers. And so what we're seeing is a simplification when it comes to EVs or clean energy vehicles, because now we don't need thousands of engineers to help develop the latest efficient petrol powertrain. Okay. Electric motors are much simpler and they're high performing. And that tells me that they're going to be commoditized very, very soon.
Yeah,
So you can have a $25,000 car, EV 5 years from now in the United States, and it can still go stupid fast because electric motors
right.
will be so. The performance of electric motors will be so democratized.
Right. And
In
no, that's
a
definitely an interesting part of it is that ability to have so much power in an electric vehicle, and it's not because you made some new version of a V8 or some sort of breakthrough. It's just kind of like the baseline.
or you
And
turbochargers or a supercharger on top of it.
right, right,
So
right. And I think that's what's really interesting for the startups and also the Chinese brands is they don't have to worry about legacy products that they're going to overshadow with more speed, more performance. That's actually an incentive for them to kind of crank it to 11 with these entry products to have plenty of performance. But and I do want to talk to you a little bit more specifically about PHEVs in the Chinese market. But I guess going back to that 9 month iteration period, um, everything you said there about having these companies that have such strong software engineering backgrounds and that kind of iterative process totally makes sense to see that amount of change in the vehicles. But do you think that I just hear a 9 month change, and to me that just doesn't seem sustainable from a almost brand standpoint? Or do you think? I guess that's there's I guess two questions on this kind of area I just wanted to discuss before we move on. And I guess one is that something the consumer is asking for, that amount of change, or is that being driven by the company to stand out? Because if it's the latter, to me, that doesn't seem like that's going to be a long-term strategy that works for a lot of these automakers.
these Chinese companies are generally speaking in survival mode.
Yeah,
So they
yeah, yeah.
see if a new product drops or new features drop on a current product, they might have a month of shine
Right.
before it gets leaped over or aped by another uh, Chinese EV maker. And so this is just survival mode.
Yeah. Well,
Okay,
and this
if
is
you're
really
not
interesting because it is kind of like the traditional software and hardware PC or even smartphone market, where it's like you have the Apple approach, and then you have a bunch of different companies that make Windows computers and are battling out on hardware specs, which traditionally is usually a race to the bottom and hasn't worked out very well. Do you think that that is
well,
kind I mean,
if you
especially with your
followed
kind of
if
background in tech, do you think that's a pretty analogous experience to what we're seeing in the Chinese EV market?
if you follow if you follow Chinese sectors, e-commerce, um, traditional sectors in China for a while, it's normally a race to the
Yeah,
bottom
yeah, yeah,
because it's so
fair.
competitive.
Right.
That's the irony, a little bit of what a lot of people think of China as the copycat thing, but it is when it comes to certain specific sectors, it is some of the most cutthroat,
Yeah.
competitive markets, much more competitive than anything in the United States and in Europe for sure. And so when it comes to here's my theory, Chase. In the
Yeah.
next 20-25 years, it's not the battery platform, the actual vehicle is not the physical industrial design or physical design of the vehicle is not really going to matter that much. If we look at the current silhouettes and we squint a little bit of some of these crossovers and SUVs, they have a Model Y silhouette.
Right. No, I
Okay.
totally agree with you.
And so if we combine that in with ride hailing, no one cares what the brand
Yeah.
is that picks you up. And in China, you and I are car guys. Love Porsches. I love Porsche. I
I
would
do.
love one
Yeah.
911 Targa in my garage.
Right.
It's a brand that has heritage that automatically will have buyers in Europe and the United States. It's probably if not it's one of the strongest automotive brands in the world. Full stop. 2023, Porsche lost 15% year-over-year sales. The first half of this year, it fell a further 30%. There are no sacred cows when it comes to brands in China. And it's not about this nationalism that some people like to think, because if you make a great product, it's going to sell.
Yeah.
Okay. And there was another narrative that somebody had written. I won't say who. It was a couple of weeks ago that were like, the Chinese government want all foreign automakers out of the country. That's a completely inaccurate and wrong statement, because what the Chinese government want to do is actually attract foreign direct investment from multinationals
Yeah.
into China. And so if they made the automotive sector so unattractive that foreign automakers couldn't play, would they be able to attract foreign direct investment from other sectors? They
No,
wouldn't. So
that's a good point. And
that's
looking at Porsche specifically, kind of talking about product mix and almost product stagnation. They've got some great products, but as far as like that level of iteration, especially on their electric side, I'm kind of curious as to if that's part of it, along with price point, in addition to. I know we were going to talk a little bit about tariffs. We can get to that in a second. But I guess the one other question I wanted to ask you was talking about the price war that did kick this off on Tesla's side. Do you see that? Has that hurt them? Has that been a benefit to them, or has that hurt them more, you think, in China?
I think they still have that distortion force field
Well, yeah,
around them.
yeah,
And if there was a $25,000 Model 2 that launched tomorrow, it wouldn't be a knockout win in China, because there's already
interesting.
a ton
So
of
many of them.
$25,000 great EVs, many from BYD.
Yeah.
They would be successful in Europe and the United States for sure. Why they haven't launched something like that yet, I don't know. But
Well, it's interesting you say that. Or I'm sorry, continue.
no, go ahead.
I was going to say one of the theories. Now it sounds like they are bringing out a $25,000 car again sometime in 2025. But one of the big theories as to why they had stopped that was due to how many $25,000 cars there already are in China and are being planned to ship globally. So I'm curious to see what, if that does follow through with a $25,000 vehicle in 2025, what it is they're going to bring to market to stand out. And we'll see if that does follow through. But I guess going to, unless there was anything else you wanted to talk about, I would be kind of curious to talk with you about tariffs.
Let me pull back
Yeah,
to Porsche a little bit.
Yeah.
Let me explain why I think it's going sideways for Porsche in China.
For sure.
Because they were effectively a niche player. 911s, Caymans, and Boxsters, and then they launched the Cayenne. Then they launched the Macan. Those vehicles in China, a disproportionate number of those vehicles sell to women.
Right.
And we know Porsche as a heritage brand. We also know it as product focused. It's not customer focused.
Yeah.
And when they sold 911s, performance vehicles, men loved it. right? I loved it. But guess what? When half of your sales are SUVs that and a good number of those sales go to women, you can't be product focused anymore.
Yeah.
And especially when Lotus launches an SUV, Polestar launches an SUV, um, Zeekr launches, there because before this is the amazing thing about Porsche. They entered China in 2001, never had a down quarter until last year, 2023. Always grew. And Porsche only sells around 380,000 units worldwide,
Yeah.
but 50% of Porsche's profits come from China and a lot of their volume. So in 2023, Porsche actually grew by 2%, despite losing 15% of sales because Europe and the United States took up some of that slack. But they can't expect that to be continue. And to your point, does the Macan EV move the needle far enough for
Right.
them?
Yeah, I guess that was going to be the only other thing I was going to talk about. That was I could be mistaken. I believe Porsche's sales are down. At least the SUVs are already down uh, domestically because of kind of them waiting to come out and deliver the new Macan EV. And I think the new version of the Taycan, it just showed like the sales of those previous gen had nosedived. And I'm kind of wondering, and I guess we'll see how much of that is due to that gap between the new product coming out. And obviously is detrimental to them when you have these brands that are able to come out with a new thing so quickly and deliver it to a market that's looking for those products.
In China, at least, Chase, it's not just Porsche. If you look at
That's true.
ABB,
That's a good point. That's a really good
uh,
point.
what we call Audi, Beamer, Benz in
Yeah, yeah.
China, um, their sales have cratered a bit too. They're getting
No,
squeezed
you're totally
both
right.
ways.
Yeah,
The ICE vehicles have lost favor from the China, generally speaking,
yeah.
and then the EVs that they've launched have just not resonated very well. And so,
Interesting.
where 15 years ago you could sell a BMW just because of the logo on the hood,
Right.
you can't do that anymore. And let me assure you, my first job at GM, that was my first job out of college working at GM. I worked at the Orion Assembly Center. We built 5 cars: the Oldsmobile Aurora, the Sabre, the shoot, I forget, but we built 5 cars there, and it became an EV plant, which is where they built the Bolt. So
Right.
there's an irony to that. And so I grew up here. So I mean, talking cars is like breathing to me. And let me assure your audience, Chase, that Chinese EVs, quality wise, are some of the best in the world. Full stop. And you're talking to someone who's or worked at several factories. And so I have no problem saying that, and I'd put money on it because if you talk to some of your German friends who worked in the automotive space, if they're being objective, they'll tell you, "Wow, this has improved significantly over a short period of time."
For sure.
Case
And
in point,
I think anyone that says otherwise lately just shows that they haven't been behind one or haven't seen one in person.
or
Yeah.
or they're trying to get clicks.
Also fair, as we were
Because
talking about earlier.
in a quick case in point, Chase, I landed in Beijing in 2009. One of the first cars I got into was a BYD, and I was just not impressed because I'm the car guy, right? I'm like, oh man,
Yeah,
this
yeah.
this car's terrible. This car's terrible. The doors are paper thin, and like it just didn't feel safe. The quality of materials was not great. You get into a BYD right now, you'd be like, wow, I don't know how the Detroit 3 are going to compete with this. And then you look at the price tag, you're like, there's no way they can
Yeah.
compete with this. And so so they have their work cut out for them.
Well, I guess talking about BYD, as you mentioned earlier, a lot of their sales are PHEVs. And domestically, obviously, the big three, and everyone was especially when Wall Street was behind it or pushing for it, everyone was all in on EVs. And now, really, this past year, EV sales are still actually doing pretty well, even though headlines are kind of like distorting
They
some of
haven't
those
shrank.
numbers.
They've
Yeah,
plateaued, but they haven't shrunk.
right, exactly. But now they're kind of going back and doubling down on PHEVs. And I think it's interesting, especially when I talk to friends of mine who are big truck guys. They're pretty skeptical of EVs, but they're like, oh, yeah, PHEVs make sense. And I have my own kind of pros and cons of that. But I'm kind of curious, looking at the growth of plug-in hybrids in China, is your feeling that there's a similar sentiment that a lot of the buyers are kind of like, oh, this makes sense, I would rather get this over an EV? Or does price and maybe lifestyle, is there more of like a practicality of choosing a PHEV over an EV? Or what is it? I'm just kind of curious of what the sentiment towards that is there versus what we see here between the two types of vehicles.
I believe they see the success that BYD has uh, on the BEV side and the PHEV side, and so in order to attract a broader
Yeah.
market, they're going to offer BEVs and PHEVs, and also the tier one cities. So there's 4 tier one cities in China. I think there might be more. I think they approved a couple more, but traditionally it's Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou. Those cities are pretty saturated with NEVs.
Yeah.
And if we go to the tier 2 cities, we're talking like Wuhan, we're talking like Tianjin, Wuxi, Changsha. They're still large cities, 7, 10, 12 million
Right.
people, but charging infrastructure isn't as mature. Okay, and then you get into even the lower tier cities, the tier 3 and tier 4 cities that still have millions of people, by the way.
Yeah.
The charging infrastructure and investment hasn't reached there either. And so we're likely seeing some of the PHEV sales and the sales growth in China, not only because there's more products to choose from, but because the clean energy movement is moving to the lower tier cities.
Interesting.
And I'm not a purist.
Yeah.
So a BEV or a PHEV is a win in my
Right.
book. Let's chalk it up as a win. And then you look at Toyota, who was very hesitant to go all in. And let me backtrack a second. Ford, GM, they were always wrong with their forecasts and being so bullish. Because if we look at it practically, if you're charging almost $60,000 for an F-150 Lightning, why would you ever say that you're going to start sales at $40,000? What spreadsheet are you looking at that made you confident to announce that to the public? Because if you're buying the batteries from China, possibly,
Yeah.
right? But your risk management teams, and these companies have huge risk management teams. There had to have been some sort of heads up that says the US government is looking at making, dialing up restrictions on Chinese batteries and or, you know, slapping tariffs on them. And so the forecast numbers were never real to
Yeah.
begin with. And so these mea culpas that the CEOs have had to make, I just never thought they were real numbers to begin with. And I honestly, and you know this, Chase, but I've been writing my newsletter for 6-7 years, and I wrote about that right when they were talking about these forecasts because I was still in China at the time, and I was like, my first question was like, where are they sourcing their batteries from? The
Yeah.
reason batteries are so important, in your in case your audience does not know this, is because it's 30 to 40% of the cost of manufacturing an electric vehicle. So you dial down the cost on a battery, all of a sudden it might become profitable. So
For sure. And I guess just to fault like one final part of that is I appreciate all that. That's really interesting, and that makes a lot of sense. I guess what I'm asking or curious about is I think you're spot on with the company mindset and execution of EVs versus PHEVs. But I'm kind of curious about, and it sounds like you kind of answered it, about the consumer mindset of PHEVs versus BEV. It sounds like for a lot of people in China, if you're in a smaller, let's say, city, and there's not the charging infrastructure, the PHEV is a pretty good uh, option. But the buyer wouldn't necessarily be closed off to getting a BEV if it fit into their lifestyle. And it just seems like so much of what I've been hearing in kind of the American sentiment from, let's say, more like middle America or traditional truck buyers that I have as friends, it's like the idea of a fully electric vehicle, they're not sold on, but a PHEV is kind of that balance. And so to me, it's interesting that the Chinese consumer is open to either, but chooses it based on reality versus, and in some ways, some of it is product fit too and product availability. But someone who is completely shut off from the idea of ever buying a BEV, and so they're just going to go with a PHEV. Does that make sense? As to kind of what I'm
Yeah,
talking about. And is that, would you say
I
that's
think
kind of an accurate reflection of what we're seeing maybe in the Chinese market versus obviously the uphill battles maybe domestically around the BEV versus PHEV idea?
here's what I would say. I think
Yeah,
there's a Venn diagram here,
fair.
right?
Okay.
There's BEV buyer, a circle of BEV buyers, a circle of PHEV buyers, and there's an overlap
Yeah,
where um, they they are curious about battery electric vehicles, but maybe aren't confident that the area that they live in
that's fair.
will invest in their grid and increase the number of charging stations. Because one of the things that I've figured out driving this Lucid for the last few days is that charging infrastructure in the United States still is horrible.
Yeah,
It's terrible, specifically in Michigan. And I live in Metro Detroit. I'm
right.
15 miles from the city proper. I don't know if that was an OEM. We don't want chargers, and so we're not going to try to encourage. But it is. I have to get to a 350-watt charger, a kilowatt charger. I have to drive 7 miles, and so that just seems really, really terrible. Because this is a loaner. I don't have an EV yet, so I don't have a charger at my home, and I'm not looking to spend 4 hours, 5 hours at a
Right.
charger. And so, the fast chargers, few and far between if you can find a charger that's within a few miles of your home. And so that's why you would, in the United States, would want to buy a PHEV.
No, and I think that's a great point. And it's interesting you bring that up because we've talked about this with a couple other people on the podcast recently about how many automakers, when you can choose like your company vehicle, that electric vehicles weren't even an option. There's these companies that are trying to sell electric vehicles, and then the people that are in charge of like designing it and like figuring the product don't even drive them and understand that experience. And obviously, as a lot of people know, that if you have a home and you're able to have a battery electric vehicle, yeah, most of the time you're doing level two. But so much of the public fast charging, unfortunately, in the US is not up to grade. And it's shocking. I still haven't been and witnessed it firsthand, but I consistently do hear from people in the Detroit area who still talk about how bad public charging is. And you would think that that would be something that a lot of the people and the companies in that area would be very focused on trying to change that experience, and also that mindset internally to have their own employees be driving them and experiencing to see where they can make those improvements. But now I'm just
You
complaining,
know
I guess.
why Tesla has one of the big reasons Tesla has loyalty? Because of their supercharging network.
For sure. For sure.
Tesla buyers, they don't have to experience
Right.
what I've experienced the last 3 days. And so if I was an OEM, I would find a way to partner with EVgo or one of these network providers, charging infrastructure providers, and own the customer experience. If
Yeah.
I truly want to increase sales of EVs of my vehicles, Now, remember, the major OEMs have all moved over to the NACS Plus,
Right.
and I think starting in 2025 model year, the charging or the hole in the female
Yeah.
in the vehicle will all be NACS. So that should help. It's going to suck for Tesla buyers or Tesla owners, but it should help the rest of the OEMs because now there's this standard. And there's an inevitability to it. You would, ping me with wanting to talk about some of the battery technology. It's not just battery technology, Chase. It's how fast chargers
For
can
sure.
charge now, like DC fast charging. Uh, in Detroit, there's a mile of highway or road that is charging under the road. I forget, like wireless
Yeah, yeah,
charging, it's
yeah.
called. And so these are some of the kitschy stuff, but don't look at it like an either or. Okay,
Oh, for
look at it
sure.
like um
Well,
and okay.
I know I
So
completely agree with you, and I think that's what I was interested to hear your experience with, because like you're totally right. Like in the U.S., we're starting to see some of the high end stuff, some of the like Porsche's new generation kind of tip 300 kilowatts.
800-volt.
Yeah, 800 volt, but like their actual charging is like around that 300 kilowatts spot. And then we have Tesla still kind of pretty much all their stuff does 250, or even the Cybertruck, I guess, goes higher now. But then you look at what not only the chargers, but some of the energy density of the batteries in the China. And to be honest with you, I'm more interested in actually the charge speeds of these Chinese EVs. But we have some that are in the 400 to 500 range. And I'm kind of curious if you've had any experience with trying or testing those out firsthand, or if you think that that's, I don't know, if you feel like any of these brands are trying to overhype what's actually capable right now and what the cars can deliver, or what you're just seeing or hearing from brands and the experience in China versus, because like to me it's still ridiculous that so many US automakers are releasing brand new EVs and the best they can do is 150 kilowatts,
Oh, it's
which
it's it's
yeah,
horrible. It's horrible. So I've experienced battery swapping in
yeah,
China. Super 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 convenient. And again, it's not an either or. It's not either charge or swap. It's and you can charge and you can swap. So that to me is is customer engagement,
for
right?
sure.
I'm gonna provide you options. And then on the charging side, so I mentioned earlier that I drove a Xpeng G9, which is the flagship
Yeah, yeah.
SUV from Xpeng. 5-seater, large. It's probably about the size of a Land Cruiser,
Oh, cool.
a Toyota Land Cruiser, and over 3 days, about 500 miles a day. And the battery, I think it was 97 kilowatt hour battery. And we drove, so we would have to charge at least once
Yeah.
during the day. We would drive from like say 95% to less than 20%. We'd go to the charging station. Did not have any issues finding a working charger. None.
Step
They
one.
all
Yeah. I
worked.
mean, just to get that is unfortunately a huge win here in the States.
And then the Xpeng interface would tell you, okay, these are the chargers that you should go to.
Yeah.
So on the map, it would just tell you, go to this charger. And then it would take between 20 and 40 minutes, depending on the number of other EVs being charged
Oh, interesting.
at
Yeah.
at the station. And so we would go from 20% to 95% in less than generally 30 minutes. So we would have lunch
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
whatever, and then go and go to the hotel, charge it up, and then have 95 again starting the next day. So that experience was quite pleasant.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we had two reasons to do this trip: test the intelligent driving and experience the charging. from northern China to southern China. And so if you look on a map, Beijing is northern China and Shenzhen is very southern China. And so, it was eye-opening. And now, even I was in California 2 months ago, and I had rented a Kia Niro EV. And this was California. I was struggling to find a decent charger because it wasn't a Tesla, okay? And then trying to find a 350 kilowatt hour charging station was really challenging. And then the third thing was it throttles you.
Yeah.
So you're never at 350 kilowatt hours. You might be at 120. Even if there's no other vehicles being charged, you're never hitting that 350. Because if you did, you'd be on your way
Right.
within 20, 30 minutes. So that's a bit frustrating because the Lucid, even I was at a 350 kilowatt hour charger, and there was a car next to me using the same charging station. So I thought when they unplugged, I would see a jump.
Yeah.
Did not see a jump. So a bit frustrating, but
I think that just totally hits on software, both on the infrastructure side and on the car side, because I think that's still an area where even the Rivians and the Lucids, who I think do above average, still aren't as good as Tesla when it comes to that advantage of just like telling you where you're going to be, how long. It essentially removes having to think about anything, and just the fact that you can do the plug and charge functionality. And something I say on this podcast a lot is, for a technology to take off, it doesn't have to be just as good, it has to be better. And for kind of the Tesla experience, where you just plug in, you don't even think about it, you can walk away, you don't have to swipe a card. That's still better than a gas station where you have to swipe a card. And it's not that hard, but it's like when you're on a road trip, especially when you've been in the car for like 3 hours and you have to beeline to the bathroom, it is so nice to just plug in and walk away, don't even think about it, let alone to deal with that. So the car has proactively kind of told you where to go, done the charging and figuring out how long. And you can either do that, and it clearly gives you other options, kind of like your experience. And then once you get to a charger, the charger does the software of like managing the site instead of it being this kind of chaotic thing. And I think that's where just this level of customer experience is like night and day between still kind of the Teslas of the world. Some of the stuff that Porsche is coming out on this new level is finally like getting there, from what I've seen at least. And then really most Chinese automakers are already just kind of doing this day one. And I think that that's still just going to be inherently until that is solved by others, that's just going to be why other people just don't understand how living with an EV really is not a challenge. In fact, it's an improvement for most people.
2 comments on that, because I agree with you. First of all, legacy automakers are normally, as like Porsche, product focused. So
Yeah.
they focus on the vehicle. They don't focus. And then you look at technology companies, in order to get stickiness on your app, on your e-commerce website, you gotta be user focused. Okay.
Well, I even
Tesla
take it a step
made
further and look at it as like platform versus just the product, kind of speaking of the software realm, where you have to look at the multiple customer interaction points. But I'm sorry, continue.
No, I think you make a great point, because again, Tesla made it seamless, right? Frictionless, right? I park, I plug, and I go. You're right. I don't need to look at the screen to make sure it's charging. I don't need to wait, 10,
I get
12
a
seconds to
notification
make
on my
sure
phone
everything
if
works.
it's ready, and I didn't know.
Yeah. Oh my God. And so the second part is really, really important. And I'm not sure a lot of people really get this. Apple and Tesla have closed systems. They
Yeah.
build their own chargers, they build their own software to integrate the hardware part to the software part. And so that's how they can create a non-buggy, seamless
For sure.
experience. And in theory, if you're using somebody else's charging infrastructure, you could, in theory, create a seamless experience. But that means that this third party charging station that charges GM vehicles, Ford vehicles, Kia vehicles needs to cooperate. And so where a challenge might be for Tesla is now that they're accepting non-Tesla vehicles, there could be some bugs that emerge from that.
And we have seen kind of
Um,
reports of that with people having some challenges or not getting the full speeds, or sometimes it derating a little bit because of heat unexpectedly. Whereas, yeah, having that closed loop system requires a lot of work, but delivers usually the optimal experience, and gets a lot of that friction out of the way. I completely agree with you.
and the other important aspect, and you know this, is that it's not only the software and battery management system of the charging station, but also the vehicle that kind
Right.
of sets the stage for a successful charging experience.
And I
And
think, well, I was just going to add to that. I think something we both kind of discussed is like the hardware element of the EV infrastructure is huge when it comes to being able to deliver and continuously deliver. But I still think a lot of them are falling or really missing on the software level of how you take this hardware and actually kind of make it think or make it smart, in the fact of like your experience exactly. Like maybe it was hardware limited, maybe there was some other issue going on, but it should know the instant that other car unplugs that yours should just shoot way to the top, um, and meet what it needs versus this kind of lag of uh, just not doing that for the user.
what's important here, Chase, is that as a consumer, I don't really care what the problem is.
Exactly.
Fix it.
Exactly.
You know,
100%.
why do I have to stand there and
And
figure
that's
out and be
exactly.
confused and be frustrated? Like,
I don't have
holy
to be
cow,
frustrated or
man.
confused when I fuel my car. I just swipe the card, plug it in, or put the gas pump in, and it works. And I completely, you are preaching the choir. I cannot, and I wish more people would understand that and kind of hear that in the industry to really resolve this. But I do realize we've already gone over a bit over time. And if you have a few minutes, I would just like to talk with you still on the tariff side of stuff. Can you go a few minutes longer, or?
Yeah, I can go till 3:30.
Okay, then yeah, let's just real quickly. I would just love to kind of get your thoughts on what we're seeing, especially we're going to an election year here in the US. And not trying to get too into the political thing, but there's obviously already been just recently with Biden increasing the tariffs on Chinese EVs, and talk of that changing in other markets too, not just the US. And I'm kind of curious on your perspective of what that has signaled to the Chinese automakers, and if they're actually really that concerned about it, or what those kind of impacts have, and any ideas that China has maybe shared about how they're going to maybe put their own tariffs on certain vehicles.
Well, there's a million things to,
Yeah,
to, to unpack
yeah.
there. I'll try to
This might, could easily be its own podcast. I realize, but just
I'll try to
any
simplify
high
it.
level things. Yeah,
So, first of all, the Inflation Reduction Act put a 100% tariff on Chinese EVs entering the United States. There was already a 27.5 or 25% tariff that the Trump
yeah,
administration had slapped on in 2018. Before that, there was always a 2.5%. So that's why when people talk 27.5%, it's 25 plus 2.5.
mm,
Now, with this 100%, it's really made it very, very unattractive for Chinese EV makers to enter the United States market. And so that's when you heard rumors about BYD and certain Chinese EV companies entering through Mexico.
right,
Okay. And I'll get back to that. But then you saw the EU do an investigation, and just yesterday they I think finalized the tariff rates on certain brands. Tesla is at 9%, BYD is at 17%. So there was already a 10% tariff uh, for Chinese vehicles entering Europe. So add 17 and 10, BYD has 27 and a half or 27%. And then SAIC, which is Shanghai Auto, which happens to be the state-owned enterprise with joint ventures with General Motors and Volkswagen in China, they own a British brand called MG.
mm,
Okay.
yep.
And because they weren't very cooperative with the investigation the EU had done, they were slapped with a 36% tariff.
Oh wow,
So basically 50%. And
yeah,
so they're not very happy. That being said, we see that BYD is going to be building in Hungary and Poland and Turkey. So, intended consequences. The EU wants jobs, production to come to Europe. Okay. The United States, it's so political still because
Yeah.
November we're going to elect a new president, and hopefully in January we're going to peacefully transition to the next
Right.
president.
Unfortunately, yeah.
So
It's gotten to that point.
2 weeks ago, there was an article about the Biden administration restricting Chinese technology for intelligent driving. Okay, and if we think about the USMCA, which is the revamped NAFTA,
Yeah.
that was the loophole that Chinese EV makers had to build in Mexico to ship to the United States tariff free. This might be the Biden administration's way of closing that loophole. Because now, if that becomes a policy, the Chinese EV makers would need to basically have two bills of material, one for the West and one for China.
Right.
They're likely most Chinese EV companies can't afford to do that. Okay, so that's a limiting factor. But instead of reconciling with Mexico and browbeating them to not accept foreign direct investment by Chinese EV companies, I think this is the Biden administration's way of, again, closing that loophole. So that pushes out EV and Chinese EVs coming to the United States, likely for at least 2 or 3 years. Okay, I don't see Trump or Harris, either presidential candidate, lifting that 100% tariff.
Yeah.
But what I do see potentially is, and you mean Trump said it point blank, you can build in the United States. And so what needs to be reconciled is if Chinese EV companies or Chinese companies are going to be building in North America or Latin America, do we want to lose those jobs to Mexico, Canada, or any other place?
Right.
As a president, because if you think about it, Trump's main source of support, or one of his main sources of support, are the southern states.
Yeah.
What would be a great reward for a Mississippi governor or an Alabama governor to have BYD write them a $4 billion check and have BYD employ about 2, 3, 4,000 Americans in Mississippi or Alabama? Okay, so there's that aspect of it, and now pre-tariff, pre-Inflation Reduction Act, pre-European tariffs, there's already talk of overcapacity in China. Currently, most of that overcapacity is on the ICE side, the petrol side. Okay, because EV companies are much smaller, their manufacturing footprints are much smaller, but it has the potential to increase significantly. Okay, because of the price war in China, many of these 140 brands aren't very successful at selling into the domestic market. That dials up the pressure to send that capacity somewhere
Yeah.
else. Okay, and so now that the United States is off limit for the short term, Europe is less attractive because of these tariffs. We're going to see the pressure release valve be Southeast Asia, be Latin America, be South America, be Middle East, be Africa, and Australia. That's what we're going to see. Now, if we look at Canada, they're talking about putting a tariff up. And so it's going to exacerbate if these countries don't want the excess capacity to go to their countries, they might have to consider tariffs as well.
Yeah.
And that's going to create a really, really weird situation in China, because one thing that's really important, Chase, is that it's not just Chinese brands that have overcapacity. Volkswagen has overcapacity
Yeah.
in China. GM has overcapacity. And if we look at all the announcements over the last 48 months, Volkswagen said that they're going to be shipping ID series EVs to Europe. Ford already ships Chinese made Lincoln Nautiluses to the United States. GM ships Buick Envision. So it's not Chinese brands that are shipping. Tesla was the number one exporter last year
Right.
from
Right.
China. So everybody
And
is
I think that was a
looking to
great point
make.
that you brought up about like the 9% Tesla has to pay, because I think a lot of people don't fully appreciate how many, even though they have a factory in Germany, how many are being imported into Europe still from the Chinese plant for a lot of the LFP batteries and all that stuff. But no, I mean,
Yeah,
all of those are amazing points.
I believe that it's one of the reasons Berlin Gigafactory hasn't ramped completely, because they have a lot of capacity in Shanghai that
Yeah.
needs to go somewhere, that can't sell into the market because they have a 4 and 5-year-old vehicle. So the demand isn't there, and they can't keep on cutting price in order to try, because it's the law of diminishing returns, right? How much
Right.
lower
Right.
can you go? And so I don't know if that answers your question on tariffs, but
No,
that's
no, no.
kind of.
I think that's a great overview, though. And like I said, I realize you're trying to squeeze a lot in, and we're coming up right on that half-hour mark. So I want to be respectful of your time. But no, I think that did answer stuff, and really kind of dived into the other topic that we're seeing globally, not just in China, which is that overcapacity. But unfortunately, that's going to have to be for another conversation soon. And I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the podcast again, too. This is always so fascinating. And I realize I could probably just keep asking you questions all day, but I know you have only so much patience. So no, I thank you again. Looking forward to doing this again soon. And this has been a great conversation.
Hey, Chase, thanks for having me, and hopefully we'll get an opportunity to meet in person sometime in the near future.
I hope so too, and I guess I will have links in the show notes. But for anyone that's listening, what are the best ways to engage with you and Sino Auto Insights, and any maybe opportunities in person or other events that you'd like to promote real quickly?
So I'd mentioned earlier, we write a weekly newsletter. You can find it at sinoautoinsights.substack.com. I think there's a decent number of readers that appreciate my perspective on the market. We get into a little more detail. I also co-host a podcast called China EVs and More. You can find it at all the major podcast platforms. We have a pretty global audience. We get into the minutia of what happens every week in the
Yeah, it
China
is a
EV
great
industry.
podcast.
Thanks. And yeah, I'll be in Vancouver the first week in September for Fully Charged. I think I'm sitting in a panel, might be moderating one, but if
That's
you are in
awesome.
Vancouver, get in touch. And then yeah, you can just find me normally being interviewed or quoted by most of the main media outlets as
I know.
well.
I feel
So
like every week I'm seeing you in some sort of clip or other interview thing on LinkedIn and others. So we'll have links to all of that in the show notes for today. And once again, just thank you so much. And we'll have to talk to you again soon. It's been too long since last time, that's for sure.
hey, Chase, thanks. We'll talk to you soon, man.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Grid Connections podcast. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Tu Li, the founder of Sino Auto Insights. It was fascinating to explore how China is reshaping the global auto industry, from electric vehicles and charging infrastructure to the rise of plug-in hybrids globally. If you found this episode insightful, I encourage you to share it with at least one other person who would appreciate the content as well. And if you have a moment, please leave a positive review on our podcast page. It really helps us continue to bring you valuable discussions like this one today. Until next week, this is the Grid Connections podcast, signing off.